afternoon. It's very dark out there, but people in the front row, if I make eye contact with you, it's only because I can't quite make eye contact with the people at the back. It's not too scary. Thank you so much for being here today. It's very wet, very muddy out there, and you're also giving up your lunchtime. So thank you very much for coming at 1 o'clock to come and listen to me speak. I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about what I do, because, obviously, you know why Brian May is here, and you know why Benedict Cumberbatch is here, but you don't really know why I'm here. So the reason I'm here is partly because my university and my college, the College of Arts and Law in particular, we like to work with Hay to share some of our work and to be here at the festival. And also because I'm really interested in sharing and hearing from other people who want to think about various aspects of fantasy. As it was said in the introduction, I'm a medievalist, so I spend most of my time teaching very early forms of English language and literature, but I also work on modern fantasy literature, so I spend quite a lot of time chatting to students about how Tolkien used Old English, for example. So those are my two hats. So on one hand, I'm sort of bouncing around the Staffordshire Hoard and recording stuff for their new exhibition, and on the other hand, I'm worrying about how fantasy writers portray the Black Country. So there's a kind of a mix going on there. Okay. This whole talk sort of started with a book or maybe a film. Now, a lot of the time when I say to people, you know that thing when you're watching a film and you think, it wasn't like that in the book? They look at me a little bit strange, but I know a Hay audience is going to get that entirely. You're all the kinds of people who've already read the book by the time you go to see the film. This started for me with a book called Stardust and a film also called Stardust. I don't know, just wave at me. Anybody seen the film Stardust? Yeah, lots of people. Read the book? Quite a few people. Okay. So maybe some of you had the same kind of shock that I did, in that I was watching the film, and the end of the film goes something like this. You have this wonderfully cheesy scene where you've got people sitting in the throne room at Stormhold, and it's the happy ending. Tristan has become the prince. It's all marvelous. You have this very reassuring voiceover by Ian McKellen. Who's better for a reassuring voiceover than Ian McKellen? And he says, "No man can live forever, except he who possesses the heart of a star." And Igraine had given hers to Tristan completely. When their children and grandchildren were grown, it was time to light the Babylon candle. And they still live happily ever after. And the close of that is of two little stars right up in the sky, looking beautiful and sparkly. Now, quite apart from the fact that I really have problems wondering what it was like for Tristan to live happily ever after as a star, something I will come back to, there was a kind of screaming moment in my mind when I thought, but that's not what happens, because this is what happens. Tristan and Yvain were happy together, not forever after. But they were happy, as these things go, for a long while. And then death came in the night and whispered her secret into the ear of the 82nd Lord of Stormhold. And he nodded his grey head and said nothing more. And his people took his remains to the Hall of Ancestors, where they lie to this day. Okay. And if you read on a little bit further, you will find that Yvain, I teach too much Arthurian literature. Yvain becomes the lady of Stormhold. She actually lives on forever because she's a star, but she can't go back up to heaven. So she becomes the eternal lady of Stormhold. And this is just as well, as it turns out, because she said to Tristan right at the beginning when they first got together, "You realize we can't have children. I'm a star. You're a human. This is not going to happen." So the original Stardust that was published by Neil Gaiman with these gorgeous, gorgeous illustrations by Charles Vess. If you haven't seen that book, that is an absolute delight to book lovers. It's really a lovely, lovely production. But that book gives you a very dark kind of an ending. It doesn't give you that sort of happily ever after. And it leaves you with this feeling that immortality is not something that just gets passed on to people. It is something that if you're immortal and you fall in love with an immortal, you're going to have a bit of a problem with. And then there was this. In July of 2012, I was about 3 rows from the front in Hammersmith Apollo, watching Queen and Adam Lambert do one of 3 fantastic concerts. And I had queued all day to be there, 3 lines from the front, in the pouring rain, I might add. It was quite like today. And they sang this particular song. And those of you who know this song, I was going to have some music, and then I thought about inviting people who knew it to sing along, but maybe I'll just stay with the words here. But those of you who know this song may know that it was, of course, written for the film Highlander, which is another song, another film, another story about somebody who is immortal, who falls in love with a mortal and has to go on living after her death. I already knew this, but I never really thought very much about this song. And as I stood there listening to this song, I found myself bawling like a baby. This is not something I normally do at concerts, so it was a bit of a shock. So I came out of that and put it together with my thoughts about Stardust and thought, well, what is going on here? You know, do we want to live forever? This song, which is written by the very wonderful Brian May, there's no time for us, there's no place for us. There's no chance for us. It's all decided for us. But then, who wants to live forever when love must die? And then you have this big swelling chorus, well, big swelling bridge before you get back into the chorus. Touch my world with your fingertips, and we can have forever. Forever is our today. Who wants to live forever? Who waits forever anyway? So, a question about whether mortal love and immortal love can ever go together, whether we can ever have a happy ending, and whether we want one, and what this tells us about how we really feel about immortality. When I came to this, I started reading around a little bit, and I discovered that pretty much everybody agrees on 2 things. And one of these things is that death is really, really bad. We're all afraid of death. There is, of course, this little edge that we know that death is kind of a little bit mixed up with desire. And we know that sort of fear and desire, the eroticism of death, we know that happens too. But mostly, we don't want to die. But on the other hand, immortality, it is said, is a marvelous, marvelous thing. Everybody wants to live forever. It is the elixir of life, it's the philosopher's stone, it's this thing that we're all looking for, and if we could live forever, absolutely we would. So I thought, well, I'll have a look at some stories and some literature, and I'll see what we actually do with this idea of immortality. Do we show people living happily ever after? It's such a cliche for our stories, but how often do people really live happily ever after? So first of all, I had a little bit of a think about this rather wonderful book by Lord Dunsany. If you like fantasy reading and you haven't yet discovered Lord Dunsany, he is the person to read. He's absolutely marvellous. This is a great novel that he published in the 1920s. It's the story of a prince who goes off to Elfland to find himself a princess, which, you know, is a fairly classic kind of story, isn't it? Go off on a quest, overcome all the magical obstacles, get the princess, go back home, get married, live happily ever after. Except that bit happens in about the first 3 chapters. And then you've got the rest of the novel. And the rest of the novel is a classic not living happily ever after story, in which Lyrazel, who is the King of Elfland's daughter herself, goes back to Earl, which is a part of Earth, the world as we know it, or the fields that we know, as Dunsany usually calls them. She goes back with him, and she discovers that actually it's kind of hard work, because they won't let her pursue her own beliefs about the universe. They have their own religion, and she gets told off for being blasphemous when she tries to talk about her kind of religion, and they don't really understand her. They find her a bit strange and a little bit odd. They don't get her. And so eventually she opens a letter with a rune in it that her father has sent her in case she should ever want to come back to Elfland, and it takes her away. Before this happens, she's already had a child, and thereon follow chapters after chapters while her husband, the prince, now the king, because he got back to find his father had died, looks for her but can never get back into Elfland, and her son grows up without her. And it's impossible to see how this will ever change. We've got a quest that cannot be completed. We've got a lost princess who cannot be found, and we've got a son without a mother. But back in Elfland, Lyrazel misses her husband and her son, and so she asks her father if there's anything he can do. And this is what Dunsany says. What could she do who would not cast away magic and leave the home that an age as a stay had endeared to her, while centuries were withering like leaves upon earthly shores? She besought a rune, that wherever they roamed, in whatever fields of earth, should restore to her Alvaric and Orion, bringing them over the border and into the elfin lands to live in that timeless age that is one long day in Elfland. Because this is the real kicker of this story, that Elfland is pretty much immortal. That time is so slow there that, as one of the trolls explains, it's got gorgeous, cute trolls, this story, it's very good. One of the trolls explains, we watch time in Elfland. And actually, that's really interesting. Orion, the sun, says, how can that be interesting? You're watching time. He says, you've never done it, so you don't know. It goes too quickly in Earth. We can't see time. But actually, if it's really slow, it's really interesting. So the problem is, she's going to live forever. They're mortal. They're in a quick world. She's in a slow world. What's going to happen? And the answer to what does happen is quite radical, because what happens is her father says, okay, all right, we've got to do something about this. You're not happy, and if you're not happy, Elfland's not happy, so we'll do something about this. So he opens his final rune of power, and basically, it is a takeover. The whole land of Elfland rolls out over Earl, just completely takes it over, until it is no longer part of the world. It's just absorbed. And this kind of takeover, even though it's not hostile, you can't help feeling it's problematic. It's an invasion. And in a book that's written not long after the First World War, that's got all kind of resonances that we need to think about. And Dunsany, who is far too clever to give us the answers, leaves us with this thought that Earl dreamed too, with all the rest of Elfland, and so passed out of all the remembrance of men. So Dunsany seems to be saying the only way for this to work is if you basically stop being mortal. If you stay being mortal, it's never going to work, and it's going to be hugely problematic. What about Tolkien? Tolkien, for all people who are interested in fantasy and living forever. Tolkien's elves, of course, are the classics who live forever unless you happen to kill them, in which case they don't. But that seems to be, that's a problem for a lot of immortal creatures. I have discovered there's an awful lot of them that will live forever unless you kill them. Tolkien has the elves, who live forever unless you kill them. He also has a whole series of creatures who seem to be living forever in a very unpleasant state, like the Nazgul. But we'll come back to them a little bit later on. Still thinking about relationships here, and obviously Aragorn and Arwen is the classic relationship between a mortal and an immortal in Tolkien's work. So, Arwen makes the grand gesture, gives up her father's heritage, does not go across the sea from the Grey Haven, stays with Aragorn, becomes his queen, has his children, lives happily ever after with him until you get to the appendix. I don't know how many people got to the appendix. Are you appendix readers? Yeah, some of you are. If you read the appendix, some of these little bits give you quite a different sort of picture. We get the death of Aragorn in the appendix. So this is Aragorn's last days, when all left him save Arwen. And she stood alone by his bed, and for all her wisdom and lineage, she could not forbear to plead with him to stay yet for a while. She was not yet weary of her days, and thus she tasted the bitterness of the mortality that she had taken upon her. So this is the death of Aragorn, which actually he seems perfectly okay with. He basically says, this is my time to die. Okay, bye folks. I'll say goodbye to everybody and I'm going. But she is not at all happy about it. And after his death, this is what happens. Arwen went forth from the house, and the light of her eyes were quenched. And it seemed to her people that she had become cold and grey as nightfall in winter that comes without a star. She dwelt there alone under the fading trees until winter came. There at last, when the malon leaves were falling, but spring had not yet come, she laid herself to rest upon Ceren Amroth. And there is her green grave until the world is changed, and all the days of her life are utterly forgotten by men who come after. Which I think is one of the most depressing lines in Lord of the Rings. Okay, so she not only outlives him, but then she fades under the trees, leaves everybody, lies down and dies of grief, sorrow, weariness, whatever, and then is utterly forgotten. So I have to say that for Aragorn and Arwen, it works out pretty well for the mortal, because Aragorn doesn't seem to really mind dying too much. And Tolkien suggests all the way through his mythology that, in fact, dying is the gift that the great creator, Iluvatar, has actually given to men. And the elves talk about it as this mystery. I don't quite understand it, the elves, because, of course, they just keep on living. And what happens to an elf after he or she dies? It's not terribly clear. What happens to men after they die? That's the really big mystery. But Tolkien says that death is a gift to men. So Aragorn has the good bit, Arwen not so much. And of course there are other people in Tolkien's full mythology who also have these kinds of issues. I'm not going to go into all of them, there are a few. But also Beren and Luthien, a pairing that was very close to Tolkien's heart. He sort of identified himself with Beren and his wife with Luthien on their gravestones. And the story of Beren and Luthien, same problem. Beren's a man, Luthien's an elf. What are we going to do about this one? Her father won't let them marry because she's an elf. He's a man. They, of course, have all sorts of adventures, mostly concerned with the Silmarils, and Beren dies. And Luthien dies of grief. So even being an elf doesn't really help very much. They get a reprieve because they turn up in the halls of Mandos, which is apparently sort of where you go, maybe, on the way to death, maybe. It's not terribly clear, but halls where you go to die are pretty typical in medieval literature, so probably the same kind of thing. And they get a temporary reprieve. They get sent back for a mortal life. So they do get a mortal life together, but then they both die. So I don't know how you see that, whether that's Luthien getting to share in the gift of death or both of them getting a happy life, but it's certainly not at all straightforward. So again, we've got immortals and immortals, difficult. Both Lord Dunsany and J.R.R. Tolkien were readers and lovers of the romances by a chap called William Morris, who everybody seems to know because of the wallpaper. All my students always say to me, is he the wallpaper chap? Yes, he is the wallpaper chap. He was, without doubt, one of the most astonishing men, I think, that England has ever produced. Extraordinarily talented, artistic, able to design, create, write, huge quantities, amazing, amazing person, and indirectly the inventor of really modern romance fantasy novel. So he wrote these 4 late romances. I'm going to talk very briefly about a couple of them because we see these same kinds of issues coming up. In his book called The House of the Wolfings, for example, there is a chap called Theodulf, and he is in love with somebody called Woodson, who is in some way or another, although it's not entirely clear how, she is not entirely mortal. So she's going to live on and live on. She's connected to the gods. You don't get the full backstory in House of the Wolfings, so you don't know, but you get enough to know that. And she's also got enough prescience, enough foresight to know that if he goes and fights with his people who are busy fighting off the Romans in this sort of imaginary fantasy past, if he goes to fight them, he's going to die. The trouble is that if he doesn't go and fight them, his people are going to die. There's only one way they're going to win, and that's if he fights with them. So he has a choice. He can either wear the enchanted dwarvish mail coat, that ring any bells for anybody? That she has given him and survive, but with dishonor, or he can fight and die, but she'll be on her own. And of course, he chooses to fight and die. So absolutely no happy ever after for Theodulf and Woodson. But he saves his people, and the story ends with this emphasis on the long years of peace that his people had afterwards. There's also a story he wrote called The Well at the World's End, in which the whole point is to get to immortality. In this story, our heroes, Ralph and Ursula, they do want to, well, not quite live forever, but live for much longer than everybody else. After many, many adventures, and when I say many adventures, I mean this amount of adventures. It's a very long book. But after many, many adventures, they eventually get to the well at the world's end, and this is what it says. Ye who have come a long way to look upon me, drink of me, if ye deem that ye be strong enough in desire to bear length of days. Or else drink not. But tell your friends in the kindreds of the earth how you have seen a great marvel. So when you get to the well, it says, can you bear a kind of longevity this would give you? Actually, maybe living forever is not that great. Maybe even living for a long time is not that great. And I can see wheels beginning to turn in people's heads. Well, yes, we can kind of see how that might not be that great. They drink. They have more adventures. They spend a very long time coming back home and meeting everybody they've met on the way and tying up all the loose ends that have become unraveled on the way. And for anybody who ever wondered why there's that long trip home from the Hobbits at the end of The Lord of the Rings, go read The End of the Well, The World's End, and it all will become clear. The long trip home finally takes them back to the kingdom where Ralph's parents, well, should be king and queen, but of course their lovely little agrarian culture, which looks peculiarly like the Shire, has been taken over, and they have to win it back again before you can have their proper happy ending. So they win it back again, they become king and queen, and, well, they live happily, but not ever after. So this is the end of it. All the days that Ralph of Upmeads lived, he was the goodliest of men, and no man to look on him had known it when he grew old, and when he changed his life, an exceeding ancient man, he was to all men's eyes in the very blossom of his age. As to Ursula, his wife, she was ever as valiant and true as when they met. On one day, they two died and were laid together in one tomb in the choir of St. Lawrence of Upmeads. So they live a long time. They live long enough for 4 generations, I think it is, to grow, which presumably means they saw their children die because their children haven't drunk of the well. So you can see how there would be cons to that. If they lived that long, perhaps they even saw their grandchildren die. And yet all the time as these people were children, grew up, aged and died, they stayed the same in the very blossom of their age all the time. So again, a little bit of a bittersweet kind of ending there. It's happy. It's certainly not ever after, however long it was, and you can see that there are problems inherent. I thought about some medieval romances as well, because of course Morris is drawing very strongly on medieval romance. Tolkien is drawing very strongly on medieval romance. Dunsany had read pretty much every book in the world. And these are models which go back into medieval romance as well. This is a story, for example, of Sir Launfal, who is having a pretty bad time, actually, because Guinevere is taken against him, and he's fallen into poverty and debt and distress, and it's really not going well for him. And one day, he just happens to come across these beautiful maidens who say, "Our mistress would like to meet you," and take him into a tent, and there she is sort of laid in beautiful disarray, and she says, "I've been watching you, and I think you're kind of marvelous, and as long as you never tell anybody about me, we're going to live happily ever after. You can see me sometimes, the rest of the time you can have your normal life, and I'll give you great gifts and you'll be wealthy again." Which is all great until he happens to be back in contact with Arthur and Guinevere's court, and Guinevere, seeing that he's doing quite nicely at this point, makes a move on him. And when he rejects her, she claims that he was the one who tried to seduce her. Guinevere is really not nice in this story. It doesn't fit in with the usual Arthurian bits about Guinevere or the endings at all, but it's one of the many medieval Arthurian romances that kind of circulate around the edges of the canon story. So, he's basically in trouble. He's in prison, and he's going to be killed or exiled unless he can prove what he said to Guinevere, which is that he has a lover of his own, and even one of her handmaidens is so beautiful that she'd make Guinevere look ugly. You can see it's an ugly thing to say to the queen. And it looks like it's all going to go really badly, and then at the last minute, Trimor comes up and saves them, so it's all good. And they seem to sort of ride off into the sunset and live happily ever after, except that at the same time every year, apparently, you can hear Lonvol's horse neighing. You can hear the clunk of his armour, because lest it should fall into rust, he comes back to joust with anybody who will joust with him in the same place every year. So, kind of implies that he hasn't got quite everything he needs in this happily ever after, because he keeps coming on back every year. Anybody want to joust? I kind of think that's rather sad, because at this point, nobody wants to joust. Sir Orfeo is another one in which Orfeo's queen is actually taken away by the king of the fairies. And you think this is going to be a very unhappy ending. Orfeo goes off and runs wild in the woods for 10 years, harping to the animals. Eventually he gets her back by tricking the king of the fairies, as you do. And they live happily until their deaths, at which point the steward inherits the throne. So there's something going on as well, whereby if you have some kind of interaction with fairies, it seems like your line doesn't go on. You get taken out of the world somehow. Your presence in the world is somehow compromised. This romance, if you're interested in such books, is beautifully inverted in a more recent book, Mortal Love, by Elizabeth Hand, which I think was published in 2006, in which she has it the other way round. The fairy queen enters our world and causes mayhem and havoc and chaos and disturbance and longing and art along the way, because obviously you've got to have art. You've got to have love before you can have art, and you've got to have heart in order to have proper love, so it all works out very well. But it doesn't, of course, because she's immortal and she goes back to fairy, leaving all the mortal men who've ever fallen for her as miserable as they ever were. Push it back a bit further again. Classical ideas of mortal-immortal relationships. There's a whole load of them in Ovid's Metamorphoses in Book 10, where we have Zeus and Ganymede. Zeus saw the boy Ganymede and thought he was so beautiful that he whizzed him up onto Olympus to be his cupbearer. Is that happy ever after for Ganymede? I really don't know. Eternal cupbearer to Zeus. There are some other classical sources, such as Hyginus, who says Ganymede was later placed among the stars as Aquarius. Again, is that a happy ever after? You're a star now. You spent some time holding a cup for Zeus, and now you're a star. Well, a constellation, to be precise, but I'm not sure that would be much of a consolation. Apollo and Hyacinthus, the clue is in the name. Apollo, obviously the sun god in Greek mythology. Hyacinthus, a very beautiful mortal who died from being struck on the head by a discus, which is, again, a really, really undignified way to go. Apollo is throwing the discus, and Hyacinthus is running and running and running to be there and to catch it, and it bounces up from the ground and hits him in the head. And that's it. So Apollo is grief-stricken and turns him into a flower, because that's how gods quite often seem to preserve their loves once they've lost them. So again, mortal and immortal is not going particularly well in this instance. And then, of course, we have Venus and Adonis, who I'm sure most people have heard of. Venus and Adonis, the great love between the goddess of love herself, this beautiful, beautiful young man who is gored to death by a boar while hunting, while Venus is kind of off doing something else. So again, it's not looking good. She makes his blood into a flower again. So seems becoming a star or a flower is fairly common for a mortal if you take up with an immortal. There are, of course, others. Selene, the moon goddess, who fell in love with Endymion. And as a result, Endymion stayed young forever by being put to eternal sleep. So he slept in a cave for the rest of his life. And, Selene popped in to see him every now and then. And presumably he had good dreams at that point. She had some kids. But he lived forever, asleep. Again, I kind of feel there are hang-ups and drawbacks that are being connected to this kind of eternal life. It's not looking like something that the human is really enjoying very much, although who knows. There's also, of course, her sister, Eos, goddess of the dawn. Another Greek story in which she fell in love with a human, this time called Tithonius, and he got made immortal by Zeus, so it was all looking good. He was going to live forever. But they forgot to say, yeah, he's going to live forever, so can he not age, please? So he ages horribly, and eventually, out of pity, Eos turns him into a grasshopper. Again, this is not really something that I would posit as a happy ending for the mortal. Yeah, I got very, very old, and then I was turned into a grasshopper. This is not an autobiographical ending that you're looking for here. And finally, of course, Cupid and Psyche. Kind of looks like a happy ending. She drinks ambrosia and becomes immortal and sort of lives happily ever after. But like Lanvol, she has to go through all this horrible, horrible stuff first. She has an immortal lover who says, okay, here I am, but there's a test. In this case, it's not to look at him, not to know what he looks like, but she fails. And then she has all sorts of horrible tasks set her by his mother Venus, who is basically thoroughly vindictive in this. And she has a completely miserable time until finally the gods take pity on her and say, okay, all right, you've suffered enough. Right. Adonis wants you back, so... Cupid. All these beautiful Greek people are getting stuck in my head. Cupid wants you back, so you can get married. Again, it's not a greatest of stories. Best, I just thought I'd show you, this is a picture of Eos pursuing Tithonius. So this is a vase dating from about the mid-5th century BC, illustrating the story that I've just been talking about. He looks like he's legging it to me. He's not looking very enthusiastic about it, which again makes us think, is this a good story, really? Or should mortals and immortals maybe not hook up together? Why are we having so much trouble getting mortals and immortals together? Can we not find some way of sorting out the differences? Why have we got this ambiguity about it? It's great to live forever, except that it might not be, or you might get too old, or you might see your children die, or you might get turned into a star or a grasshopper or whatever. Why can't we have just nice, straightforward, happy endings? I think probably it's a couple of things. First of all, they interfere at some profound level with what we think of as natural. Because what we do think of as natural, whether we're afraid of it or not, is death. But all of our lives have an ending. Some of them at a time which seems very right and fitting, others at times which seem far too soon. Freddie Mercury being a case in point. But they are lives which end, and so lives which don't end are a kind of taboo for us. Not least because, that's something which our brains can't begin to process. We struggle also to imagine what life without death might be like, and especially in relation to ideas about time. What is it like to have an eternity of time? How do you cope with having endless, endless minutes in front of you? Would you ever do anything? It's arguable, I think, that mortality is the single most motivating factor in humans' lives. That the more you become aware of the short time you have, the more concerned you become about making the most of it. And if your goals were endlessly deferred, and if your life was going to go on in the same way eternally, would you do anything? Probably not. I think psychologically, the thought of immortality is a kind of stasis for us. It's equivalent to not doing anything, not going anywhere, just being. And we're not set up for that. We're set up to move, to age, to have time whizzing past us, to feel that time goes too quickly, but through that to become fully realized, creative, interesting people, as opposed to people who can endlessly sit in a room and watch the wall or be a star. So is immortality a good thing? Well, everybody says it is, but I'm increasingly convinced that probably it isn't. There are all sorts of arguments about this. I particularly like the Epicurean arguments about it. This is a quote from, obviously, their chief guru, Epicurus, who says, "The correct recognition that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable. Not by adding on an infinite time, but by removing the longing for immortality." Actually, if you realize that death is just natural, it's going to happen and that's that, it's not particularly something you need to be afraid of, then you stop wishing that you weren't going to die, and then you can have a much more fun life. Lucretius, who is one of his disciples, has a whole set of other arguments that follow on from this, which are to do with all sorts of, in some ways, very practical things like, if everybody lived forever, the population problem would be terrible. This is in classical times, we're having this kind of conversation now, at the point where scientifically, perhaps we're starting to think, will we be able to do this at some time in the future? How long can we prolong life? What happens to the population if we can endlessly prolong life? Lucretius was bothered about that too. The Epicureans were bothered about that, and they said, actually, you know what? Living forever is not something we should be thinking of. It's something that actually stops us living creative, fulfilled lives right now. So do we really want to live forever? Is immortality something we desire? I'm not sure it is. I ought to do a straw poll at the end, shouldn't I, and see how many people think they want to live forever and how many people don't. Can we actually get over our fear of death sufficiently to think that immortality would be good? But even, can we imagine an immortality that's not ambiguous? That's not full of these endings where we go, would that be so great? I'm not sure. And interestingly, I think, the ways that we're exploring it now are a lot to do with kinds of creatures which we don't want to be. Okay? Because frequently at the moment we're talking about the undead. Now, I am by no means an expert on vampires and zombies. I'm going to talk about them a little bit now, but if you're looking for someone to talk about the details of zombie films from, I'm not your woman, I'm afraid. Mostly because I'm a real scaredy cat when it comes to films. I watch them between my fingers or from behind the sofa. But I want to talk about the undead a little bit because I think actually we've been worrying about the undead for a very long time in all sorts of different ways. Most people, if you read vampire narratives, they say something like, Bram Stoker brought in this term to talk about vampires, and nobody was using it much before then. But actually, we find very early times this idea of the undead. The Old English undeadlich, which literally means like the undead. How are they using this term, though? Do they mean that there are zombie-type creatures or vampire-type creatures wandering around? Well, no, they use it like this. God is strong, heilig, and undeadlich. God is strong, holy, and like the undead. which is possibly not some way in which you thought about God before. I find it really, really interesting. The general use of the word immortal, which of course is brought in from the Latin, does not come in until the late Middle Ages. Anglo-Saxons use undead for immortal. That's what they do. So this is another one in which God made the first man. This is about creation. He made him holy and righteous and like the undead. Now, why are they saying like the undead? I find it very, very interesting. Obviously, it's the only way that they can think about what it's like being dead. They have a word for living. They could say like the living. The quick, which we still have in the quick of your fingernails, for example, the living bit. But they don't use it. They say, actually, people who are going on living after their death are like the undead. Now, unfortunately for us, we have very little Anglo-Saxon mythology left. Although, fortunately for us, that inspired Tolkien to write Lord of the Rings and all the rest of it, so swings and roundabouts. But we don't have enough to work out really what they meant. But we do have enough in Scandinavian traditions to know that there is material there that could have been the kind of thing that he was thinking about. So we have the Draugr or the Haugboar in Norse, who are animated dark corpses, solid bodies. They cause trouble for humans in all sorts of ways. They come back out, but the Haugboar are dwellers in house, in burrows. When you've buried somebody, sometimes after cremating them, you might build a barrow over the pyre, or sometimes you might just bury them in there without a cremation. But if you bury them in there without a cremation, it seems they come back sometimes. And in Norse traditions, you've got to have a particular door and take people out of the door with their head the wrong way and then brick that door up so they can't come back in because they don't know where the door is. Because they might come back. There is a lovely, lovely Norse story in which there's a chap who has promised his brother that he will go and sit with him after his death in this barrow for 3 nights. So he goes, and the first night his brother animates sufficiently to eat one of the animals that's being left, and the second night another, and he still goes back the third night, at which point, of course, his brother tries to eat him. It's not looking ideal, but it's part of the whole thing that there are lots of worries in medieval period about keeping the dead dead. It is at that point when we come across people decapitating and staking, burying people with a stone in their mouths. They've recently found skeletons in both Ireland and Poland with stones in their mouths. Keep the jaws open so that they can't somehow come back and start consuming you. So, got to be very careful about that. So these traditions of the undead are very much circulating around, and I suspect it's these kinds of people the Anglo-Saxons are worrying about as well. Now, of course, we think about vampires as elegant bloodsuckers, mostly thanks to Lord Byron and his effect, both stimulating and annoying, John Polidori, who wrote the first narrative about him. But they're only allergic to sunlight because of the 1920s film. Certainly, I don't think anybody ever thought they were before that point. And in the Eastern European context, which is the place from which we sort of import this blood-sucking idea, actually, they're not always blood-sucking. I have a Polish student who's working on Polish and Russian vampire narratives, and in one of them, there is a vampire who basically lives by sex. She's not actually a succubus, but she feeds on the lives of the men that she draws in. So these kinds of creatures have their own cultural reinterpretations. And they come from a mixed tradition, but they're still kind of floating around and worrying us. Would you like to be immortal, but be a vampire? Would you like to be immortal, but be a zombie? Theoretically, zombies are products of Haitian voodoo. If you read all the books, that's what they'll tell you. And the 20th century film turned them into horror. But in this sense, they are the dead reanimated, specifically to be under the control of one's person. That's what the voodoo zombie is like. And actually, this is something you see in lots of fantasy books as well. And I just thought, Shadowhounds and Garthnick's books, if anybody's read Sabriel and all those kinds of books, you will recognize the idea of bringing the dead back as creatures who are controlled, who then become basically hired labor for somebody's purposes. But also, of course, now we have the idea that zombies might be reanimated due to disease. And we also have this idea that they need to eat people. So possibly, these kinds of ideas come from mixing the Eastern tradition with European traditions, perhaps. So maybe this is all a mix. But what it does show us is we're still very, very, very much concerned with these people who go on living when they should be dead, that ambiguity and those worries are still there. We've started trying to think about the good undead, what Margaret L. Carter calls the good guy vampire. And these are vampires who try to act morally rather than just going around killing everybody, and they only drink donated blood, preferably from blood banks, because then, it's kind of okay. And there's even a Good Guys Wear Fangs fanzine, so if you want to read about good vampires, that's the place to go. We are trying to think about ways in which these creatures might actually have good immortal lives, unless, of course, you get spiked by a vampire hunter. So these are people like Angel and Spike from Buffy. But are they vampires? Are they not vampires? They're pretty nasty until they get their souls back. And only when they get their souls back, they think, oh, okay. They behave a lot better. Are they still vampires at that point? I've read books that say that they're definitely not vampires at that point. A vampire with a soul is not a vampire. You might disagree with that, but it is a problem. Of course, we have the Cullens in Twilight, super sparkly vampires. And in that, we have the whole kind of idea that some vampires are better than others. There are good vampires trying to fight off the bad vampires. They're trying to do good things. And those are trying to do bad things, even though they've all got to kind of eat blood and have very scary skills and possibly dubious relationships. I also don't know how many of you have come across Siobhan Quinn in Blood Orange, is the first book in that series. She gives us some vampires, addicts trying to do the right thing. It's the idea that vampires need blood feeds very much into modern ideas of addiction, things we need, things we've got to have if we're going to go on living. Siobhan Quinn in Blood Orange is actually a junkie. She's a heroin addict. And then she gets the double whammy of being turned into a werewolf and a vampire at the same time, which is about as bad as it gets, I think, for eternal life. It's really not good. She calls herself a werepire, which is etymologically as bad as it sounds, but there you go. So you've got this double problem with her in that she's an addict already, but now her addictive behaviors are to do with blood and consuming humans and turning into a wolf. But she's also pretty brutal, and those are very grimy books. She lives in this horrible, horrible apartment building, and she never has any clean clothes, and she's got no money, and she's always having to rip people's heads off, and she can't control them. She turns into a wolf, and then she eats people unexpectedly. It's really not a good life, even if you are the good undead, which she is, I think. Because she's the first-person narrator and you sympathize with her, so the more horrible things happen to her, the more you think, oh, God, Gwen, I hope she's going to be all right. But actually, she's a blood addict and a serial killer. And she lives a terrible, terrible life. So even when we try to imagine these good, immortal creatures for ourselves, we end up thinking of them as actually having not such great lives. And of course, all of them you could still kill. What about zombies? I was trying to think, good zombies. Are there good zombies? Well, there are rehabilitated zombies in Shaun of the Dead, aren't there? You know, you can get your zombie to play video games with you and deal with your supermarket trolleys. That seems like not too bad. The problem with zombies, of course, is that mostly they are depicted as not having any kind of mind. And what is a human if not a mind? You know, what kind of immortality would we be if we couldn't think enough to be ourselves? We're getting around this, though, in interesting ways. Don't know if anybody saw this film, Warm Bodies, which came out last year. which has the idea of the zombie boyfriend. He's still dead, but he's getting warmer. So apparently if he's kind of has good intentions, he doesn't want to eat people so much, and he has the love of a good woman, it'll kind of be okay somehow or another. It's not ideal, but we do also have Bram, the aptly named Bram, in Dearly Departed, which is the first of a series by Leah Habel. It's a young adult series. It's a post-apocalyptic, futuristic, post-nuclear, Victorian, steampunk, young adult romance zombie novel. And he is tall, dark, and dead. Okay, we have a human female, again, why are the girls human in these? And we have a zombie hero who means well. And they're presumably going to be okay, except that, he's dead. And it goes into quite specific detail about all the things that are needed to keep his dead body going. He needs fluids, and he needs to be looked after by a medical team. And he loves her very much, but he has this overwhelming desire to sink his teeth into her, which I can't help feeling is going to put a stymie on this relationship. It's not going to go that far if that's how he feels. I also thought, what about the undead in Torchwood? I don't know if it had occurred to you before, but it certainly hadn't occurred to me before I started thinking about it. How much of Torchwood is about immortality and the undead? Loads of it. First scene you ever see is the Torchwood lot temporarily bringing somebody back to life, just for a few minutes so they can freak him out and he dies again, but there we go. Jack Harkness, of course, is repeatedly undead. He died, and then he comes back, and then he dies again, and he comes back, and he keeps dying and coming back. He's the most undead of the undead. And you get kind of seduced by the fact that Captain Jack is this charismatic, wonderful, super sexual kind of creature that you think, maybe it's pretty good to be Jack Harkness. Actually, it really isn't. The kinds of things that keep happening to Jack, and the fact that the producers and writers felt the need to keep making it worse for him, and specifically said so. There was a conference at which they said it hadn't got bad enough for Jack. He's lost most of his team already. We had to take the rest of them away, pretty much. We'll leave him Gwen, but hey. The rest of them, they'll go. He's got to lose everything. Oh, yes, and by the way, he's going to kill his own grandson. Yeah. Is this a great immortal life? I don't think so. Owen Harper, of course, is temporarily undead. They bring him back after he dies, and then he wanders around really being quite miserable about being dead. He's not very happy as an undead. He gets a kind of brief moment of glory in when he discovers that he's kind of king of all the nasties now. But then he dies again in a sort of nuclear reaction, so he's probably not coming back after that. And also, all the time, there are all these people in suspended animation in the hub. There's all these bodies just sitting, well, lying. I hope they're not sitting, actually. That would be very freaky. But lying. They're all just lying in those cryo chambers, I suppose they are, in the hub, waiting to, in some cases, think of the First World War soldier, he gets woken up and unfrozen once a year. And then he gets to go on a date with Tosh, and then he gets frozen again, which doesn't sound great. And most of the others, presumably, all got killed when the government blew up the hub. So all those years of storing them has gone to nothing, and nobody's ever going to come back from that one. Torchwood, to me, when I started thinking about it in terms of the undead, it's like a kind of unrelenting litany about how terrible it is actually to be undead, and about how living forever is a really, really difficult and problematic thing. Every now and then you get the doctor sliding in the side there saying, I'm 900 and something or other. But life for the doctor is not exactly a bunch of roses either. And however much they try and cheer him up every now and then, losing your entire people, even if you kind of fudge that bit later, is not a good thing to happen. One particular book I wanted to talk about was this one, Handling the Undead by John Linkvist. Some of you may know this. Some of you may also know his perhaps more famous book, Let the Right One In, which has been made into a film and was also a theatrical production which opened recently in London. Let the Right One In is an incredibly clever kind of vampire story, which muddles up all the boundaries for you. By the end, gives you this really profoundly disturbing image of the vampire coming in to wreak what you've been seduced into thinking is justifiable vengeance on two teenage boys. She becomes the avenging, or he becomes the avenging angel. If you read it, you'll realize why I made those two possibilities. But actually, when you stop and think about it, it's really profoundly disturbing. And it also makes it clear that the life of a vampire is connected with serial killing on a huge scale. That in order to live, they have to keep killing other people. Handling the Undead is a different kind of a book. The basic premise of this novel is that we're in Sweden and 2,000 recently deceased people come back to life. They're people who've died in I think it's the previous 6 weeks. Suddenly they all wake up, which leads to all kinds of horrors, including them discovering, of course, that all the people that have been buried are trying to get out of the coffins. So the army has to come in and dig them all up. It's really quite distressing. How do people react to this? Well, on one hand, you have the people whose loved ones have died recently, who are in this really difficult situation, where on one hand, they've got their loved ones back. Isn't this fantastic? But on the other hand, their loved ones, well, for a start, if they've been in the ground for 6 weeks, they don't look like their loved ones anymore. And it very quickly emerges that they don't think like their loved ones anymore, and they don't speak. In some cases at all. In some cases, they don't speak like the people they used to know. They speak like machines. They're not the people they were. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you've got the media whipping people up into a frenzy and talking about people's rights to see their relatives and how this should be dealt with. And then you've got the scientists who are trying to work out what on earth is going on, why these people have all just come back to life. And he writes a whole series of media reports in this, where he says, okay, he imagines how different sections of the world media would react. He actually does them in different languages. So if you can piece your way through, it's quite interesting to see how the different cultures react. This is part of an editorial written about it, and it says, the events of last night will force us to reformulate the conditions of our own existence. In all likelihood, researchers will be able to determine what has caused the dead to become reliving. Possibly, they'll be able to repeat the results. Our present method of handling the corpse of a human being is basically organized around destroying it, either quickly through cremation or slowly by way of decomposition in the ground. In a month, a year, or perhaps 10 years, we may find ourselves with a cure for death. Who will want to be cremated then? But what this novel develops, what it shows us as we go through, is that actually this is absolutely horrific. That there is nothing worse. And that in fact, all these people, all that's left inside of them, of these people, is a tiny soul that just desperately wants to go. It doesn't want to be trapped inside this useless body in a world that it no longer belongs to or understands. That it's desperately trying to find a way of following the natural order of things. The scientists very quickly discover they can't keep a hold on this. This isn't something they can make happen. This isn't something they can reproduce. It isn't something they want to reproduce. It's really profoundly unpleasant. And by the end of it, the ultimate act of love, which is seen through the lens of, on one hand, a mother who gives up her child, who's already dead, obviously. She lets his soul go, and a husband who has to let his wife go. And this is the natural order of things. So the end of that novel brings us back round again to say, okay, maybe it's better to be dead than to be undead. So I think the good dead are developing all the time. They're very, very problematic. They're less than human. And they occupy this really ambiguous space that demonstrates that we still have trouble imagining a positive immortal life. Do we really want to live forever? I suggest we probably don't in most cases. And I wonder whether perhaps the film version of Stardust is actually the unhappy ending. I wonder whether natural life and death are much more desirable. And mortals who take on immortality of whatever kind seem to be fraught with so much trouble that in the end I think probably, if we were all to sit down and think about it carefully, we might ask ourselves whether we really want to live forever. Thank you.